the Chinese production capacity would not rise, primarily because although the United States was slowly returning to normality, it meant that China, now facing competition from Vietnam, from Colombia, from Paraguay, other countries, at lower costs, was not going to regain the position it had. So I want to begin with two dates that are crucial in understanding this moment. One is 1992. Three things happened in 1992. The fall of the Soviet Union, the signing of the Maastricht Treaty, the implementation of the Maastricht Treaty, and the emergence of the United States as the only global power. Remember that until 1992, there was a Cold War. It did not always look like the United States would win. The United States is obsessed with the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union is obsessed with the United States. With the fall of the Soviet Union, it was like if you've ever seen tug of war and somebody cuts the rope. The United States was completely off balance. It did not know how to respond. It still does not know how to respond. We should remember that the British Empire begins with Britain being defeated by a third world power that could never possibly do that, the United States. Nevertheless, in spite of this defeat, the British Empire emerges and dominates the 19th and the first part of the 20th century. It is almost inevitable when you look at Rome or other empires. But the first stage of beginning an empire is not planned, and the political system that is governing it doesn't know what to do. So it should not be a surprise that one of the characteristics of the world is the only global power very uncertain as to how to respond to events. What are the things that matter to the United States? Where should it involve itself? Where should it not involve itself? These are uncertainties that will take a generation to work out. So we live partly in a world in which the organizing power is highly disorganized. And this is simply the process of unilateral global power. In 2008, something else happened that's extremely important, what I will call the global export crisis. From the 1980s onward, the international economic system overbuilt its industrial plant. This was particularly true in emerging countries like China. Their industrial plant had to be larger than the domestic consumption because this was how they would generate the capital to maintain that. And this was regarded as brilliant because it was believed that those countries that could export the most were the most efficient, and those who couldn't export were weak. It ignored one basic problem, which is that the exporting power was a hostage to its customers. If its customers couldn't buy, its industrial plant was paralyzed to some degree. In 2008, a financial crisis, the fourth since World War II, hit, and it destabilized first the United States and Europe, which were the great customers of China, and they could no longer buy as much as they had from China. And the Chinese, who were dependent on the marginal increase of exports, suddenly staggered. Their basic model of neglecting domestic consumption and maximizing exports ran into a brick wall. They were, in effect, owned invisibly by the United States and Europe. As I say, Walmart and Carrefour were the great powers that governed China's future. And suddenly, China had to find a new way to manage its system. After this, you wound up with another problem, which is those countries that sold to China primarily industrial production, industrial minerals, oil, copper. Now they had lost their market. For a very long time, it appeared to the commodity markets that, well, the Chinese will go back to consuming. The price should stay up. I want to buy more because the Chinese will consume. They did not understand that the decision on consumption by China was in Europe and the United States. If they could buy, then they would buy more goods. Finally, in 2014, it became apparent that the Chinese production capacity would not rise, primarily because although the United States was slowly returning to normality, the Europeans were much more divided in their consumption patterns, much more limited in what they were going to do. It meant that China, now facing competition from Vietnam, from Colombia, from Paraguay, other countries, at lower costs, was not going to regain the position it had. And so the price of oil particularly fell. This destabilized Russia in the sense that the promise of some sort of construction of a normal modern economy, which had been neglected since 2001 for various political reasons and structural reasons, was not going to happen. Now Russia had to worry about its ability to maintain its national budget, and that was very difficult. It had to dip into its reserves, and it's still struggling with this question. What had been a very powerful position, an exporter of energy, became a trap because energy consumption was not growing. In fact, in many places it was declining. The second country that experienced this was Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia was built politically on oil. It was built politically on oil because it could maintain the internal stability of the Saudi kingdom with the careful distribution of wealth, stabilizing the tribal systems within the royalty, all these things that had to happen. The Saudis are no longer able to do this. Suddenly, the Iranians emerged, dominant in Iraq, present in Syria, dominating Lebanon, operating Yemen. So you look at the map, all around Saudi Arabia, the heart of the Sunni, it's surrounded by a Shiite power. How deep, how powerful this power is, this is another question. But it certainly destabilized the Middle East. So you had a situation where the Chinese now had a financial problem, which always follows a decline in exports. How to manage bad debt. And they didn't know how to do it because managing an NPL crisis, a non-performing loan crisis, normally requires somebody to be hurt. The creditors, the debtors, somebody is going to pay. And the Chinese, like every country, didn't want anybody to pay. But since they were going to have to pay, it had to have a more powerful central government to control the pain. And Xi emerges not out of China's strength, but out of weakness. If it was strong, they wouldn't need a dictator. But it's not strong, and it needs a central government that can stabilize it through an extremely painful period of time. For example, it has to get rid of the corruption, and for that it needs a powerful leader who is not vulnerable to counteraction. In Russia, you have Putin, who had promised prosperity and returning Russia to being a great power, not quite having the prosperity any longer, not quite a great power, doing things in Syria, partly because he can, because he must do something. In 1992, for the first time in 500 years, no European power was a global power. None. Russia was the last, and it fell. The only global power was the United States, which was completely unprepared for this. The world created a structure that was what I'll call cantilevered, like a Gothic cathedral. Every part depended on every other part, and if you pulled one part out, the entire thing came down, plunging the world into an economic crisis, which is now a social and political crisis. You can't put the genie back in the bottle in Europe, in China, in the United States, anywhere. We are now in a political period of instability, and in that political period, we will hack through for the next 10 years at least, trying to find out what to do. But there is one constant in all of this, nationalism, which the European Union wants to declare to be evil, and it can. But the fact is that there's a secret in Europe, a secret in China, a secret in Russia, and a secret in the United States. I'm an American, you're a Portuguese, they're a Russian, he's a Chinese. And we love who we are. We have a love of one's own. And so, as this crisis deepens, we're drawn farther and farther apart. We demand that the Chinese stop aggressively exporting, but they must. They have no choice. We want the Russians to stop being pseudo-aggressive. They're not really aggressive, but they want to look that way. They can't.